hailing back from the days of Medarot 5 and making his grand debut in the world of 3D. It is DOG03 Brutis, with the kits of Break Rush, Hammer, Power Hammer, Biped Legs, and the leg ability of Soaring, which buffs all leg stats minus armor and heavy limit up to 5 stacks for every melee skill used. Now, as another returnee from the days of the Game Boy era and Medarot 5, it's certainly nice to see yet another rather vague model officially make their grand debut in the world of 3D and join the rest of the family and the roster with a new kit and a fresh look. And Brutis is most certainly no exception to this for a number of reasons. The first of which is the fact that he is currently the only melee-based dog type in the entire family. And in addition to this, he is also sporting a leg ability that was previously exclusive only to collab bots, and now also available for males no less. Break Rush on the head part is a gravity attribute skill that is basically Break Hammer, but instead of having a passive pierce damage installed, it packs passive AoE instead. Which means if the enemy is packing 2 or more heavy parts like any other standard gravity skill, you will be dealing the immense amounts of pain and just making sure that the extra weight is a punishment to the target in question. Whereas if they are only packing 1 or none heavy parts, definitely not as much damage if at all. But even with the base power of 1310, that's still pretty solid even for an AoE skill. And given that Break Rush is an AoE, it may not break anything as easily as Break Hammer will because it is an AoE skill, but it does make it very easy for someone to come up behind Brutis, if not him on the next turn, to absolutely wail on that target and break a lot of stuff a lot easier without having to break things more than once and rely on pierce damage. Hammer on the right arm is a conventional melee skill that you really can't ever go wrong with using, but it's also a full AoE much like Break Rush, which means it will spread the damage evenly across all active and intact parts on the target in question. So if it's all 4 parts, damage to 25% each, or if it's only 3 or fewer, it will equalize the damage across those. The only real exception to this rule is if they use Conceal or anything like Cybercore, which will then divert all the damage to one exclusive part instead of spreading it evenly. Power Hammer is basically the same instance, but with just a little bit stronger of a push. And with that, it means that Power Hammer will get a times 1.5 damage bonus when attacking the target as long as Brutus's legs remain intact. If his legs are broken, it basically serves as a regular hammer, and at that point he becomes Break Rush, Hammer, and, well, Hammer, until his legs get restored again. But even then, it still as a full AoE is a more consistent form if you're looking for consistent damage for AoE skills. And at first glance, you may look at this triple AoE kit and think he may not be super viable at first glance, but that's actually where you're wrong. The Break Rush actually gives him coverage against heavy foes, which is very, very good. And between Hammer and Power Hammer, he has pretty decent coverage over keeping himself well protected or well guarded, or risking himself for extra damage if he can be covered on his cooldown. In addition to this, now that Hammer has an extra viability thanks to the Silent Leader mechanic, it does mean that he's going to be a lot easier and absolutely invaluable for trying to pick out the enemy leader from the team without having to nuke them every time and then guess and hope and pray that you're on the right one. Simply by attacking them with an AoE skill like Hammer or Power Hammer or Break Rush, upon attacking the enemy head part, it will basically tell you for a fact if that is the leader or not. Now when it comes to his stats across the board, Brutis is actually pretty moderately tanky with some good stats at base, and that's not including any modifiers he has going for him. A head HP of about 3600, right arm about 2850 is pretty much his only really squishy part there. Left arm at about 3150 and legs at 4250. Even with that squishy right arm, it's still a pretty healthy HP pool to be expected. His leg stats are actually pretty solid too at base, and that is not including before any buffs from Soaring go into effect. A base mobility of 763 is nice in that little sweet spot where you typically want to stay for biped legs, though he's not going to be the fastest on the field, but he still will have some good mobility going for him. But with an evade of 1078, pretty solid for dodging or grazing incoming attacks. A melee resist of almost 1400 and a shoot resist just a little close to 1050 there means he actually has some pretty solid armor underneath all that bulk, so he can hold his own moderately well on the field even if he can take a lick or two before actually going down. Plus, with Soaring buffing all of his leg stats, minus armor and heavy limit, for every melee skill used. After about 3 or 4 turns, he will progressively be going faster and become harder to nuke because he becomes bulkier and harder to hit on top of that. All this being said, though, as a pure set score, I still do have to rate Brutis a pretty middle-of-the-road 6.5 out of 10. Primarily for the reason that even though AOE skills now have immense viability as leader finders thanks to the silent leader mechanic, as an AOE it still does call a lot of his consistent damage into question, because he has no passive pierce damage, no single target nuking. He's going to be designed very largely on peppering the foe or prepping him for someone to come up behind him, more than him actually dealing the coup de grace himself and dealing that massive damage by breaking a lot of parts at once. But Soaring does kind of tie that back and forgive him just a little bit, as it does mean that he is bulky, he is tanky, and with the boost from Soaring, he actually can get just a little meaner on the field. And his base power across all 3 parts, even as AOE skills, is pretty nice too, if I'm being real with you. Break Rush about 1310, Basic Hammer at almost 1800 and non-heavy, and Power Hammer at a little over 1750 but heavy. But that's also not including the times 1.5 damage bonus. As mixed parts, I do have to rate him just a little bit higher at about a 7 out of 10, primarily for the reason that even though you can kind of argue Brutus's AoE-based kit and kind of make it forgivable to a point, mixed parts is going to be really where he shines the most. His legs in particular, especially for your dominant melee fighters thanks to Soaring and very solid base stats on top of that, and in the case that you do need it for whatever reason, Break Rush, albeit heavy, Hammer, probably you may not use super often, if at all, because we already have 100 different basic hammers already. But Power Hammer can be made for the same case because we do have a pretty fair number of them already. But another good one with some very solid base power behind it too still doesn't hurt all the same.